If you walk into a grocery store in a major city, a basic basket of staples, milk, eggs, bananas, and flour, costs somewhere around $10 to $15. But try acquiring those exact same 4 items in the northern community of Fort Severn. The price tag before subsidies hits $140. This diagram illustrates what drives that massive gap. We are measuring last-mile friction, the exponentially escalating cost of moving physical goods through extreme environments. That friction exists because paved infrastructure abruptly ends hundreds of kilometers away. There is zero physical connection to southern hubs. These logistical anomalies reveal the unshielded costs and hidden vulnerabilities inherent in modern global supply networks. This map plots 3 distinct case studies: Fort Severn in Ontario, Grise Fiord in Nunavut, and Sax Harbor in the Northwest Territories. Watch what happens when we remove the permanent North American grid. The southern infrastructure recedes, leaving these coordinates stranded in empty topography. Without paved roads, these communities operate on temporal logistics windows, brief, strict periods where weather conditions temporarily permit transit. Survival here means treating seasonal shifts and deep freezes as the infrastructure required to move freight. Let's start with Fort Severn. With a population of roughly 500 people, the community demands a volume of heavy bulk goods, like construction materials and non-perishables, that far exceeds the weight limits and economic viability of air freight. To meet that demand, their primary bulk logistics route utilizes a flat-bottomed industrial barge, making an 800-kilometer annual journey, originating in Moosonee and navigating across Hudson Bay. The critical fail state for this route is early sea ice formation. If the bay freezes ahead of schedule, the barge aborts the trip, severing the town's bulk supply line for an entire calendar year. When the maritime route closes, a secondary winter route opens. A seasonal ice road is constructed across frozen muskeg to connect the town to Manitoba. This diagram shows the engineering strictures of that route. Subsurface frost depth and precise ice thickness directly dictate the load-bearing limits for incoming freight trucks. If either the maritime window closes early or the ice road fails to freeze deeply enough, the community defaults to emergency air cargo, introducing a severe financial shock to the local economy. To prevent systemic collapse, the federal government applies a required logistics patch known as the Nutrition North Subsidy. The mechanics of this subsidy artificially suppress that $140 grocery basket we looked at earlier, pulling the consumer cost down to roughly $30 by offsetting the extreme air freight premiums. Fort Severn's supply chain is a heavily subsidized, weather-dependent tightrope. We see an even tighter constraint in Grise Fiord. Situated at 76 degrees north, this settlement is physically closer to the North Pole than it is to any southern urban center. The ultimate bottleneck here is absolute. The total absence of roads or marine bulk options forces a 100% reliance on air transport. Under this air-only model, aircraft payload capacities strictly throttle the volume and caloric density of every imported good. You can only eat what a plane can physically lift. From a logistics standpoint, this raises a critical question. Why construct a permanent settlement in a location completely hostile to commercial supply chains? The geopolitical trigger occurred in 1953, when the Canadian federal government executed a forced relocation of Inuit families from northern Quebec to this specific stretch of ice. This was the weaponization of human geography. The government positioned these families in the high Arctic strictly to assert Canadian territorial sovereignty during the Cold War. Upon arrival, this top-down logistics model immediately failed. The families were dropped onto the permafrost with zero foundational infrastructure and no reliable supply lines. To survive, the community replaced these non-existent commercial supply chains with decentralized, hyper-local harvesting networks. They tracked beluga migration routes and species like the ringed seal, forming a self-sustaining caloric web drawn directly from the local wildlife. Grise Fiord demonstrates that when centrally engineered logistics fail, human adaptation and deep local knowledge are the only mechanisms capable of bridging the gap. Our final case study is Sax Harbor, an isolated settlement of 104 people situated on Banks Island, a landmass roughly the size of Ireland. Their baseline logistical fragility is extreme. The entire community relies on a restricted window of merely 2 supply flights per week. We can see the physical mechanics of permafrost thaw in this cross-section. As subterranean ice crystals melt, the structural integrity of the soil vanishes, causing the surface layer to collapse downward. This thawing process poses an immediate geographic threat to Sax Harbor. Rapid coastal erosion is actively dismantling the physical footprint of the town. This image provides clear visual proof. You can see the deep, sheared earth receding directly beneath the exposed foundation of the building. The collapsing terrain triggers a secondary cascade effect. As the ground gives way, it deposits massive volumes of mud and silt directly into the local freshwater systems. That localized pollution chokes out the fish populations, cutting off the community's critical supplementary food supply of lake trout and Arctic char. The third point of environmental failure occurs offshore. The winter sea ice window is shrinking rapidly, and its duration is becoming highly unpredictable. Without predictable sea ice, residents lose the traditional travel routes they rely on to hunt and offset the strict limits of air freight. To hold the line against the ocean, there is a proposed infrastructural patch, constructing a heavy defensive berm to protect the receding shoreline. The problem is a logistical catch-22. Importing the massive tonnage of raw materials required to build that defense is nearly impossible when your primary access point is a light aircraft. Climate degradation is dismantling the physical platform required to keep these supply lines operational. We looked at 3 distinct edge cases: Fort Severn's subsidized temporal routes, Grise Fiord's air-only isolation, and Sax Harbor's eroding foundation. The shared vulnerability across all 3 is clear. Survival depends on precise, predictable environmental conditions rather than static infrastructure. This proves that extreme isolation is determined by the fragility of supply connections. This reality stands in contrast to urban supply chains, which operate under the assumption that concrete is permanent and the climate will remain stable. The failure of these Arctic networks highlights a broader engineering challenge: the dangerous reliance on environmental predictability to maintain physical distribution. Future logistics engineering must prioritize climate adaptability and local resilience over rigid systems designed only for peak efficiency. Studying the breaking points at the edges of the map teaches us how to build resilience before the center begins to fail.